The purpose of this talk is to give you some ideas or suggestions on how to write a comparative essay. The first thing I will say is that there is no one way to do it, otherwise we'd have figured that out by now and everyone would be doing it. There are a number of variables that come into play. For starters, your own personality and the way you work. Secondly, the complexity of the assignment. Third, the amount of time that you have to work with. And fourth, the actual nature of the text that you are comparing. Let's begin just by looking at a few PowerPoint slides here. And I think I want to set you up by showing you that there's a number of different ways to think about the essay itself. And writing happens in two ways. It happens as a process and it happens as a product. Process is what you go through when you're writing the draft. Product is what you actually use to communicate to other readers. And so over here it says process is basically a private activity. In other words, when you write in the early stages, you're only doing it to help yourself think and to get ideas out of your head and onto paper or onto screen so that you can externalize them. And I promise you, once you externalize them, they will become clearer. You cannot do this stuff in your head. I also believe you cannot do it using an outline, because an outline allows you to skim over ideas and doesn't help you get granular. The point about early drafts is, for my writing anyways, they're all crap. They are meandering. They are desultory. They roam from point to point. I try to go with the flow and don't overthink things. If I'm about to prove something and I can't find the quote right away, I just put in brackets, find the quote later. I'm busy focused on the energy of getting ideas out of my head and into some other medium. And that's why they're meandering, and that's why in early drafts you have random associations between things. It is a kind of free association. And this is how we think. This is how the normal mind thinks. I don't know if you've had this situation where you've been sitting around with friends at an evening talking about, I don't know, the Leafs or some particular sport, and the next thing you know, nobody quite knows how, but you've ended up talking about vacations in Cuba. Well, that kind of free association is very natural for the human mind. To use essay writing as a product, however, as a method of communication, is something very different. And I want to emphasize that it is unnatural in terms of how we think, but it is the best way to explain things by imposing a logic. So when you finally come down to your last draft, it is a public statement. It is linear, not meandering. The links are all logical and explained to the reader. And you're not using it as a thinking tool anymore. You're using it as a way to communicate to other readers what you have thought. So if you keep this in mind, I think it'll be a good sort of keynote for how we proceed with a comparative essay. So what I'm suggesting here is that there's three stages. In the early stages, you're basically doing inventory work and summary work. It's very high schoolish. Who are the characters? What has happened? What are the main events in the story? You are going to sort of work things in a linear fashion. It's going to be more descriptive than argumentative. You're not going to have a thesis. You're going to have some quotes and paraphrases. And as you begin to write, it says here, let the structure or sequence of the work determine the structure and the sequence of your thought. So in the early stages of writing, let's say first draft, the first part of your essay talks about the first part of the story, the middle of your essay talks about the middle of the story, and the end of your essay talks about the end of the story. So the chronology of events in the narrative are mirrored in how you organize your paper. You can't stay there because you can't let the text determine your understanding of it. initially, there is no other way to do it that I know of. You have to go through chronologically. But after you've gone through chronologically, you have to go to what we call structure, which is the hierarchy of importance. And after you've got all the intricacies of the plot worked out and all the main ideas, you have to identify what you think is the most important idea, that structure, because now you're saying this is primary. And that is a judgment call that you have to make in the early stages. In the middle stages, you want to shift the organizing principles away from the chronology and over towards what I call here alternative organizing principles. A particular theme, a particular style, something that is, I don't know, characteristic of the story. And you then start with the longest and strongest ideas first, and I'll visualize this for you in a different way. And finally, in the last drafts, what you're doing is introducing your own theory about what is happening in the text and imposing your ideas on it. So there's no point in writing a comparative essay where you give me a laundry list of, well, you know, both authors use characterization and both authors use setting and both authors talk about this. It's completely unhelpful because it's really a very low order of thinking and you haven't imposed your own mind on it. Let me demonstrate this for you another way, okay? Now, comparative technically means to find similarities. In some assignments, it means to find similarities and differences. And the Norton is very good on this. If you go to page 1932, you'll see that there are, or that chapter at the back, I think it's 1932, I may be wrong, gives you a couple of ideas about the block method of writing and about what they call point by point or side by side. You should take a look at those because those are tried and true methodologies. I don't say they're good. I don't say that they'll work for you. I say that you should take a look at it, and if it helps you reason through things, then use it. But in our sense, compare really means to look for the resonances and resemblances and echoes and reflections and motifs between the two stories. So it isn't about sameness as much as it is about similarities or variations on a theme. A motif is a recurring pattern that happens. It could be a plot sequence that happens, or it could be a number of psychological moments that recur. But you're looking for a more subtle way of looking at similarities. Now, my method is I always start with two separate essays. I write one short essay on story 1 and another short essay on story 2. And it says here, I don't mean point form. I mean full, complete prose sentences, two separate essays, so that I have a really clear understanding. This maps to my PowerPoint slide where I talked about getting an inventory or a summary or a sense of what's going on in both of the stories. You have to know both the stories thoroughly first before you can start to look at how they fit together. And in that sense, comparison here means how do these stories fit together? Not so much how they are the same, but as I said here, how there are resonances and resemblances with variations. That's absolutely the key. We're not looking for sameness, but resonances. And always begin with the biggest primary areas of concern first. So you always have to start with what is the topic and what is the theme. If you haven't figured that out, there's no point in talking about anything else in the story. Setting, plot, characterization, narrative structure, none of that means anything unless you figure out what that text is arguing. And I want to remind you again, we come from the premise in this course that every literary text intends to persuade us about something. That every text has an agenda, whether it is conscious or unconscious, it doesn't matter. That every literary text is trying to persuade us to think something, feel something, be something, do something, but there's always an act of persuasion, and that always has to do with the theme, which is the argument or the thesis of the text. The topic is what it's about. So you might have two stories where there's a shared topic about the socialization of women. That's a topic. That is not an argument. That is not a theme as far as the text is concerned. And when you write your own paper, that is not a thesis. But I think you have to start with the biggest and most important material in the story first. You can't do that until you've got a laundry list of all the events. Then you move to secondary and then to tertiary. So you have to impose your opinion and your will on this inventory that you are gathering, this inventory that you're collecting of events and interesting points in the story. So after you have two separate papers, sorry, I'm multitasking here. After you have two separate papers, you transfer all the points from text A. I say put them in a column. So put all the main points of text A into the left column and all your main points of text B into the right column. And use point form and keywords, and you'll start to see ideas that match up. And as this says, look for the big stuff first, the most important stuff. So here's what you are not aiming for. You don't want an essay organized by text, where in the first part of your essay you talk about text A, and in the second part of your essay you talk about text B. I think for writing as process, in the draft stage, yes, this is what you must do. You can't not do it, but this is not where you end up. This is not writing as product, this is writing as process to help you think. What you are not aiming for ultimately is an essay organized by plot or storyline, where the early part of the essay looks like the earlier part of the text, and so on. So what you are aiming for, with the longest and strongest ideas as they appear in both texts. And let me show you with a little diagram here, okay? Not so good. This is where you organize your paper by first you talk about text A, 1, 2, 3 ideas in text A, and then you talk about text B, idea 1, idea 2, idea 3. Of course, that's where you have to start. You can't not start there, but you can't end there. My little bad joke here, the more gooder way is you take one of these ideas, 1, 2, or 3, that recurs in both stories and decide, you know what, I think it's idea 2 that really is the most important idea or parameter in both of these stories. And then the way you organize your paper is you talk about a particular idea first and go text A and text B. So I want you to see now the difference is, in this version, the organizing principle of the paper is the story 1 and story 2. In this version, the organizing principle of your essay is the concept in both stories, as it appears in both stories. And your paper moves through ideas in both texts rather than through text 1 and text 2. However, I'll repeat it one more time to make sure you got it. You can't get to this model until you've actually written this model. So that is my advice on how to proceed with your comparative paper.